Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys. Pardon that little bar there. So today we are going to be talking about sort of a bit of a background of what happened in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, like internally. And then we're going to look at the three promises made by Britain with respect to the Middle East during the First World War and how this promise kind of gets played out with the mandate system. And then we'll really look at the aftermath in the next video when we look at the Hashemite kingdoms. So just with that all being said, let's share the screen. Promises in the Middle East. Share. Slideshow. Ha ha ha. There we go. From current slide. Again, key terms and hard words are all at the front. This will be the largest of the three Africa, Ottoman Empire, Middle East lectures. So there's at least 2 pages of key terms and hard words on the PowerPoint. So again, this will be what we're looking at today. We're going to look at the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. Then we're going to look at the promises 3, the 3 voices, the 3. I tried to sort of think of it as a band. So we sort of have 3 different people singing at the same audience, but from slightly different song sheets. We have the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then we have the Balfour Declaration. And then with the mandate system, this is one of the 2 ways that these promises are sort of tried to be kept. The second major way will be in the next video with the Hashemite kingdoms. All right. So again, just to give you an idea of the area that we're talking about, this is the Ottoman Empire circa 1914. The names there are the mandates that will come out of this territory. And this is the European portion of the Ottoman Empire, circa 1800. So in this video, we're going to focus on the effect that the First World War had on the formation of the modern Middle East. Now, war in Europe will, sorry, this kind of bothered. There we go. War in Europe will break out between 28 July 1914. That's the date when Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and 4 August 1914, when Britain enters the war on the side of the Triple Entente. Now, during the First World War, names are kind of a little strange. Triple Entente, E-N-T-E-N-T-E, that's Britain, Russia, France. On the other side, we have the Triple Alliance. We have Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Reason I wanted to mention that is it gets a little confused because we have the Allies versus the Axis in the Second World War. So anyways, now the Ottomans will be one of the 2 latecomers to the conflict. They'll join on the side of the Triple Alliance, so the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, in November 1914. Italy was the other one. They will join the Entente in 1915. Now, as we talked about in the last video, Ottoman power had been slipping away for the past 100 years, so much so that the Ottoman Empire was often referred to as the sick man of Europe. Now, the Ottoman Empire did attempt a period of reformation known as the Tanzimat period between 1839 and 1876. Now, it's interesting because I talked about how in the nation states video, how the Europeans are going to take some of the ideas of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and bring them to South Asia or bring them to China. In this case, in the Tanzimat reforms, these ideas are coming through osmosis, essentially, because remember, we have this nice European section of the Ottoman Empire. And so ideas are coming into the Ottoman Empire as the Europeans are trading more, as they are rebelling, as they are engaging politically, as they are fighting the Ottomans. So these ideas are starting to sort of seep into the Ottoman Empire. And so leading into 1839, several Ottoman leaders understood that the old religious and military institutions of the Ottoman Empire simply didn't meet the needs of a modern world. And so the Tanzimat period, 1839 to 1876, this period of reform, the idea was to reform the empire just enough so that the European nations, including Russia, would not expand at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, and at the same time address those, particularly in the European areas, who are agitating for their own nationhood. So the Tanzimat reforms, two sort of competing and comparable ideas, two ideas that work together at the same time. They're kind of bumping into each other. The first one, reform the empire enough so that the European nations, including Russia, would not expand at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire would not lose more territory. I apologize, there's something going on outside. I'm going to briefly stop sharing and pause the video. The joys of working from home. Just had a big road truck go right by my road. All right, so we were talking about the Tanzimat reform. So let's get back to the PowerPoint, which means I need to share my screen again. Sure. Boop. Ha. So two reasons behind the Tanzimat reforms. Number one, reform the empire just enough so that the other European powers will stop trying to take chunks out of the Ottoman Empire. Second reason, to try to address those within the empire, particularly Greeks and Romanians, basically people in the European side of the empire, people who are agitating for their own nationhood, agitating for independence. So they're trying to sort of appease that group as well as appease the Europeans. There we go. All right, so the start of the Tanzimat reforms will be the Edict of Gulhane. 1839. Just give me one quick second. So the Edict of Gulhane. Now, this is an edict brought forth by the Ottoman Sultan, the Ottoman Emperor, and it's designed to try to, again, pretty much reform the empire just enough, but not too much. To give you an idea of some of the clauses. So it's kind of interesting seeing some of the European ideas mixed in with some of the sort of Ottoman ideas to come together. So, for example, one of the clauses of the Edict of Gulhane was, no one will be permitted to assail the honor of anyone, whoever he may be. So it's setting up the protection of one's honor. The idea of honor as a natural right. Another one, every person will enjoy the possession of his property of every nature and may dispose of it with the most perfect liberty, without anyone being able to impede him. I mean, all you have to do is just go back to the nation state lecture and hear me talking about Locke to hear these European influenced ideas. Every person will enjoy the possession of his property and be able to dispose of it with the most perfect liberty. So property as a natural right. These imperial concessions extend to all our subjects. whatever religion or sect they may belong to, and they may enjoy them without any exception. This idea of natural laws again, not you. There's no one set law if you're Muslim versus Jewish or Christian. Perfect security is therefore granted by us to the inhabitants of the empire with regards to their life, their honor, and their fortune, as the sacred text of our law demands. So this is where it gets a little interesting, because perfect security, natural laws, are granted not by God, but by us. That is the Sultanate, the Caliph, the Ottoman Emperor, to the inhabitants of the empire. So you kind of hear echoes of Hobbes with regard to their life, their honor, and their fortune. Life, fortune, very Lockean, life, property. So adding in honor is sort of a little twist on it. And then bringing it back to God, bringing it back to religion as the sacred text of our law demands. So you have fundamental laws given to man by God, very Lockean. These rights have been granted to people by God. Now they're being granted by the sovereign to the people. Very Hobbesian in view. Now, so it had promises of security for life, for honor, for property. Going on, I won't read it all to you, but there are requirements for mandatory military service. And this is important because it's a means to try to tie the various people, because there are a lot of different people in this whole area, trying to tie them back to the state. So if a Greek, this sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but a Greek, an Arab, an Egyptian all walk into the same military barracks. Ha ha ha. But the idea is for mandatory military service to tie people more closely to the empire. You're fighting for the empire. You're not fighting for your own potential country. It created a modern banking system. Before 1839, there was no modern banking system in the Ottoman Empire, which was why the Europeans were allowed kind of to sort of come in and give all these loans, because Egypt, Algeria, etc. couldn't get them anywhere else. And it also started a modern education system. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Constitution. Well, why don't we do that now? So the Ottoman Constitution. So the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 will end the Tanzimat era. So it'll run from 1839 to 1876. Now, the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 did a couple of different things. The first one I want to talk about is what it did politically for the Ottoman state. So what it did is it created sort of a mixed power system. Sorry, it sounded like that same truck was coming by, but it's not. So, for example, for the Sultan, it allowed him to appoint and dismiss his ministers. So he had control over the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Law, Ministry of that's Ministry of Law, the Treasury, etc., etc. And he controlled that by appointing and dismissing their ministers. They serve at his beck and call. And also the Sultan, the emperor, could dictate foreign policy. Now, on the other side, they established a General Assembly with an elected lower house and an appointed upper house. very much like the House of Commons, House of Lords. And they provided some constitutional guarantees: right to life, right to liberty, right to property. Right to life, right to property, right to honor. And to give you guys an idea of what the Constitution of 1876 was like, well, I knew that. Let's share screen and let's look at the Constitution of 1876. So what I've done is I went to the Constitution of 1876 and I pulled some of the articles out of it just to sort of give you guys an idea. Okay, that's what that is. Just to give you guys an idea of what the Ottoman Constitution, what sort of ideas they were pulling in. So again, we had the two competing ideas. Idea number one, reform enough so that the Europeans back off, while at the same time giving just enough rights so that the other nations within the Ottoman Empire stop agitating for independence. So Article 8, all subjects of the empire are called Ottomans, without distinction, whatever faith they profess. The status of an Ottoman is acquired and lost according to conditions specified by law. So that is, you're not a Greek, you're not an Egyptian, you're not an Algerian, you are an Ottoman. And as a result of becoming an Ottoman, every Ottoman enjoys personal liberty on condition of non-interfering with the liberty of others. This is a very libertarian concept. The idea that I have the liberty to do whatever I want up to the point it starts affecting someone else's liberty. Speaking of liberty, personal liberty is wholly inviolable. So nobody can inflict themselves on your own personal liberty. No one can suffer punishment under any pretext whatsoever, except in cases determined by law and according to the forms prescribed in it. So only the law can determine punishment and the diminishment of one's liberty. With religion, Islam is a state religion, but while maintaining this principle, the state will protect the free exercise of faith professed in the empire and uphold the religious privileges granted to various bodies on the condition that public order and morality will not be interfered with. So yes, Islam is a state religion, but unless you start creating a public order nuisance, you can pretty much exercise your faith however you wish. Freedom of press. The press is free within limits imposed by law. Education. Education is free. Can you imagine if a constitution today said, hey, education is free for everyone? Every Ottoman can attend public or private instructions on conditions of conforming to the law. And as a part of that, schools. All schools are under state supervision. Proper means will be devised for harmonizing and regulating the instruction given to all Ottomans, but without interfering with the religious education in various districts. So now you don't have to be the son or daughter of a rich Ottoman or middle-class Ottoman. You could basically go to school regardless of your class because education is free. Article 17 are all Ottomans are equal in the eyes of the law. They have the same rights and owe the same duties towards their country without prejudice to religion. This is an interesting and important sort of addition that the Ottomans are putting on. Yeah, everybody has natural rights. Yes, natural life, liberty, property. Yeah. That's what the Europeans are doing. That's what the Americans are doing. But the Ottomans are adding duties. Just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean you can. the Ottomans are saying, as an Ottoman citizen, you have corresponding duties, which includes mandatory military service and the like. The only eligibility for public office is you need to know how to speak Turkish, which kind of limits who could run for office, because not everybody could learn Turkish. Although if they go to school, they certainly could. Property, real and personal, of lawful title is guaranteed. No dispossession unless according to the law. And the domicile, the home, is inviolable. Authorities cannot break into any dwelling except in cases prescribed by law. And I just added torture and inquisition under any form are wholly and expressly forbidden. All right, stop sharing. So I will be posting that if you want to take a look. I just went to, it's a, I think it's the Avalon project from Yale, has the Constitution. I just went there and just copied and pasted some of the articles, which I think illuminate what the Ottomans are trying to do. So let's go back to sharing screen. Boop. All right, from current slide. There we go. Now, the constitutional period, even though I say the Tanzimat era ends in 1876 with the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, the Constitution will pretty much be in place for about 2 years, 1876 to 1878, before the emperor basically goes, no, this isn't working for me, and basically shelves it. The Young Turks, who we're going to talk about briefly, in the 20th century will be pushing for a return to this constitution when they take over. Now, there are some reactions, both mostly negative, but some positive, to the Tanzimat reforms. They varied throughout the empire. So you tend to find resentment amongst the religious elite, Sunni clerics, various other religious elite, who feel that these reforms were un-Islamic. You also have some resentment from the Arab notables and the Arab landholders. These were people who felt that they were threatened by the growing power of an educated elite within the bureaucracy. They were afraid that if, with everybody getting an education, their sons won't get the traditional path to power. They have more competition within the bureaucracy. Now, the Arab notables will actually have a more concrete foundation for their fear, because as things progress, the young men coming out of the education system, the young men entering the bureaucracy, entering the military, they're going to be the ones leading the challenges to the Ottoman Empire. It's not going to be the other nationalities. It's going to be the people that the Ottomans are going to educate and bring into the military. This would include men such as Mustafa Kemal. He will later be known as Ataturk. Yet, in spite of all these reforms, in spite of these reforms trying to sort of push off the Europeans, the Ottomans still required European assistance to hold back the Russians during the Crimean War. Again, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856 in this area here. And really, as I suggested in the last video, after the British and French support against Russians, things really start going downhill for the Ottoman Empire. The British and the French are going to push for greater sovereignty for the ethnic minorities within the empire. The British are going to push for Egyptian sovereignty. The French are going to push for Lebanese and Syrian sovereignty. And we're willing to put pressure on the Ottomans to ensure this greater sovereignty within the empire. So by the dawn of the First World War, you not only have the growing threat of nationalism throughout the empire, in places like the Balkans, in places like North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, so down in this area, Anatolia. All these places are starting to see themselves less than Ottoman and more Arab, Turkish, German, not German, sorry, Greek, Egyptian. So that's sort of the background. There we are. Background to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. So let's talk about the meat and potatoes of what's going on. It's time to look at the McMahon-Hussein correspondences, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration. Now, to talk about what's going on, I have to sort of talk about, my apologies, swallowed wrong, the Young Turk movement in 1908 and Arab nationalism, the initial contacts between Arab nationalist groups and the British, and then talk a little bit more about this. So the McMahon-Hussein correspondences is the first of 3 British voices, which will help shape the modern Middle East. And at its core, the McMahon-Hussein correspondences are a series of letters, correspondences, between Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, the big dog in Egypt for Britain, and Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca. So to go back, these are the 2 men we're talking about right now. Sir Henry McMahon and Hussein bin Ali. His position is the Sharif of Mecca. So with Arab naming principles, basically what the naming principles mean in this case is bin means son of, essentially. So we have Hussein, son of Ali. These 3 men here, Abdullah bin Hussein, Faisal bin Hussein, and Ali bin Hussein, are the sons of Hussein. So their name is Abdullah, son of Hussein. I just noticed I put an additional S there. And Hussein's position is the Sharif of Mecca. Now, this is important. Mecca down here, Medina right here. Basically, the Sharif of Mecca controls access to the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. And so, in essence, the Sharif of Mecca is the 2nd most powerful Muslim, potentially, in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan would be the 1st, the Emperor would be the 1st, but the Sharif of Mecca has a significant voice within the Ottoman Empire for Muslims. Now, what happens in 1908 is we have the Young Turk movement, or the Young Turk Revolution. And basically what they do is they throw out the old sultan, who basically got rid of the constitution, and replaced him with someone much more pliable. But just as important, they established the Ottoman Empire as a constitutional monarchy. So now the Sultan is basically the same type of position as Queen Elizabeth. Sorry, Queen Elizabeth II. So that means the Sharif of Mecca becomes a much more prominent voice for Muslims within the empire. Now, you would think, hey, let's keep that type of guy on our side. But what the Young Turk movement did after they took power is they pushed a nationalist agenda on the Ottoman Empire, focusing on a prominent place for Turks, because the Young Turk movement came from Anatolia, So basically they came from the center of modern day Turkey. So they're a Turkish people. And so they wanted prominence, a place of prominence for their people within the empire. And obviously this would spur resentment amongst the other nationalities, particularly within the Arab community in the Arabian Peninsula. At the same time that this is happening, you have a number of pro-Arab reform groups start popping up between 1909 and 1914, most of them as secret organizations to try to avoid Ottoman infiltration. Not always successful, but they tried to be a secret society to make sure that the Ottoman secret police, for lack of a better term, didn't come in and take them apart. So you have military groups like the Young Arab Society, Al-Fatah. Sorry, my mistake. You have non-military groups like the Young Arab Society, Al-Fatah, who wanted to demonstrate, quote, the unity and strength of the Arab movement. They were predominantly located in Syria, and many of their members would be known to the Hussein family, which will become important in a minute. You also have military organizations such as the Covenant Society, Al-Ad, consisting largely of military officers calling for, quote, Arab independence, respect for Islamic values, and the institution of the caliphate. So they want sort of a reinstitution of Islamic views, Islamic institutions. They believe that the Young Turks went too far by basically turning the Sultan into a constitutional monarch. So we'll go here. Whoop. Now, I'll move myself back up because I like being in the corner. Ahaha. Now, when the Ottoman Empire declared war on the Entente, the Sultan, after being told by the Young Turks, called for a military jihad against the Entente and urged Hussein bin Ali to support the jihad and provide forces. Going back to jihad, again, jihad just means struggle. However, in this case, we are talking about a military struggle, a military jihad against particularly Britain as well as Russia, because those two countries had large groups of Muslims within their colonies, within their territories. And so it was a means of trying to cook up a fifth column, cook up a behind the lines military force. And so the Young Turks had this jihad called and urged Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, to support the jihad and provide forces. And as I said, because of his position as Sharif of Mecca, Hussein was the steward of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and his support for jihad would have unified the Turks and the Arabs against the Entente. It would have brought together the Arabs, would have brought together the Turks to really form a more unified front. Now, leading up, so we're looking now probably 1912, 1913 into 1914, Hussein had been contacting the British. He'd been contacting them, he'd been trying to woo them. Woo! And he's looking, he's looking at what's taking place, there we are, what had been taking place in the Persian Gulf. Now, along the Persian Gulf, you have what's called the Trucial states. Trucial, the Trucial states, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman. Trucial, Trucial. These are states that had entered into subsidiary alliances, a 20th century version thereof, with Britain. Basically saying you can use our territory for military bases. You can, by 1909, you can start looking for oil in our territory, provided you provide protection for us. And so, Sharif of Mecca, right here, 1912, 1913, had been sending letters over to Egypt to try to convince Britain to enter into a treaty, enter into an agreement, effectively guaranteeing the independence of the Hejaz, the territory that Hussein controlled. And for the most part, 1912, 1913, the British were basically doing a foghorn leghorn. Go away, boy, you're bothering me. Basically shuffling him aside. They saw no real benefit to it. 1914, in February 1914, Hussein sends his second son, Abdullah, over to Cairo to try to start some in-person negotiations, to start making contact with the British authorities in Egypt to try and see if they can start sending guns to sort of militarily support an Arab revolt. And again, things are sort of shunted aside. And obviously this is taking place before the war, so Hussein is trying to portray this as a defensive pact. Basically, just it's a mutual defense pact. Come in and help us if the Turks come on in. And so Abdullah is sort of shuffled aside. He's sort of put into, not literally, but figuratively, sort of put into a box for later. He's sort of sent back. And then obviously things start changing when the Ottoman Empire enters a war on the side of Germany. Egypt, the people in Egypt see how close the Ottomans already are with respect to Germany. Germany at this point is trying to build a Berlin to Baghdad railroad. Actually, this will work. A Berlin to Baghdad railroad, basically connecting Berlin to Baghdad, hence the name, which would allow more open transportation within the Ottoman Empire. And so the British in Egypt see a already close Ottoman Empire in Germany. And so when Britain enters the war, they contact the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein, and start asking, so you mentioned once how you might want to rebel against the Ottomans. Is that on the table still? And the second son, Abdullah, responds by saying, yes, we would support Britain in exchange for your British support against the Turks. Shifting away from a defensive pact to now, we will support you if you support our fight against the Turks. And they hummed and they hawed throughout August and September and October. But when the Ottomans declared war in November of 1914, Egypt sends over a message saying, quote, if the Arab nations supported Britain in the war, the British would recognize and support the independence of the Arabs and further guarantee Arabia against external aggression. Basically sort of setting up, if you support us, we will support your independence, and guarantee you against external Turkish, read Turkish, aggression. Okay, so they get that back. Now, Hussein is fairly certain that, yes, he can rebel here, he can bring up his own troops, but the Turks can just come in and start laying the smack down. So in January 1915, Hussein sends his youngest son, Faisal, Faisal, north to determine the viability of a revolt amongst the various Arab secret societies. Now, the reason Faisal was sent north was that the guys in Constantinople, the Young Turks, were getting a little tired of Hussein. They were going, hurry up, either agree with us or we will replace you. So what Hussein did is he basically said, I'm sending my youngest son to Constantinople to explain all the positions, and yes, we will think about joining up as soon as we can, basically putting off the Turks. Faisal's mission, basically head up north through Damascus, through Amman in Jordan, through Aleppo, and basically figure out whether or not an Arab revolt was viable. And then he goes back up to Constantinople, back down to Aleppo and Damascus, and finally returns home. And after months of negotiations amongst the Arab secret societies, so it took him months to get there, months to get back, months to get there, weeks to get back. Basically, what would happen is, because they're secret societies, you can't just go and say, hi, I'm here to determine whether or not anybody wants to revolt against the Turks. That would kind of get your head off. So Faisal basically did was he engaged in Arab hospitality. And what I mean by that is he would go to the notables, the major players in Amman, in Damascus, in Aleppo, and basically tell the Turks, yes, I'm on my way, but one of my dad's oldest friends is in Damascus, and I cannot come through the town without saying hello, without having tea or coffee, without having dinner. And he would use these excuses to basically go to dinner and then negotiate with members of the secret society. And so he goes all the way to Constantinople, he comes all the way back. And after months of negotiations, Faisal remains unconvinced of the viability of an Arab revolt. He says there's no way that the Arabs can revolt on our own unless we have the outright support of one of the major European powers. And so he returns home with his father, or to his father, and says, Dad, I'm not too sure about the revolt. We need to get Britain, France, one of the major powers, on our side. However, the secret societies did say they will support a revolt if one of the major powers agrees to what was referred to as the Damascus Protocol. The Damascus Protocol. Now, the Damascus Protocol will form the basis of the McMahon-Hussein correspondences. The Damascus Protocol will form the basis of the McMahon-Hussein correspondences. Now, in this protocol, in the Damascus Protocol, the various secret societies said, yes, we will agree to support Hussein in an Arab revolt against the Turks in exchange for British recognition of an Arab state. So this is basically Hussein going, yes, this is exactly what I want. They will support me. If I could get Britain on side, I'm going to try and get Britain on side. He wanted recognition of, Hussein did, of an Arab state. However, initially, Hussein was looking for the independence of the Hijaz, the independence of the area that he personally controlled. But with the Damascus Protocol, they called for an Arab state made up of Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. Basically, they called for an Arab state, Yemen, Oman. They called for an Arab state of the entire Arabian Peninsula. They wanted one Arab state for this whole. If you want us to revolt, we want British or great power recognition of this whole area as one Arab state. And Hussein went, yes, fine, that's great. That gives me control over more land, Muha, because I'm obviously doing all the legwork here. I will be king of this new area. And so in June 1915, Hussein calls for his family to come together, calls for his oldest son Ali, his middle son Abdullah, his third son Faisal, and they debate over whether or not to engage in a revolt against the Ottomans. The oldest son Ali comes down against rebellion. He's very much afraid of what will happen to him and his family should the rebellion fail. He's going to lose all his power, and likely his family are going to lose heads, so he's very much against it. Abdullah, the second son, who was already negotiating with Britain, is going, yes, we have to do it. I promise you we have Britain on side. We must rebel against the Ottomans. The Ottomans are just going to come for us anyway. And Faisal, the third, argued for caution. Let's wait. Let's get Britain on side first. In the end, the decision amongst the debate, Hussein decided to set the date for the Arab revolt a year hence on June 1916 and commenced immediate negotiations with Britain. By the way, this would be Ali, Abdullah, and Faisal. So, starting in June 1915, on the basis of the Damascus Protocols, Hussein begins direct negotiations with McMahon, Sir Henry McMahon, in Egypt. And the McMahon-Hussein correspondences, through a series of letters between McMahon and Hussein, an agreement was concluded between Britain and the Hijaz for an Arab military revolt against the Turks. Now, it's important to note here that this agreement wasn't made just by a British officer who was exceeding his authority, but rather at every step of the process. McMahon contacted London, and London would continue to authorize him to continue the negotiations. In the end, McMahon, for the most part, accepted the demands for an Arab state. The only exceptions he made, he said, we're not going to allow you to have this area west of Damascus, that is Lebanon. And they did so because they were concerned about French interests in the area. And they were afraid that the traditional French interests that we talked about with respect to Lebanon would give the French an excuse to just jump in and seize the territory for their own. So they said, okay, we're taking that part off, and we want to create a bit of a buffer zone between Anatolia, that is Turkey, and this new Arab state. So We're going to create a buffer zone here, and we're going to make sure that the French, we're going to exempt this area just in case the French want it. So McMahon and Hussein came to an agreement. This territory here in exchange for an Arab revolt. Now I'm going to jump ahead to 1918 because this takes McMahon-Hussein correspondences take place in 1915. We have in 1916 the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then in 1917 the Balfour Declaration. Things that kind of start having the Arabs go, wait a sec, we're starting to see problems here. And so in 1918, Britain issues continued assurances that yes, we agree. We promise you we will go through with the McMahon-Hussein correspondences. 16 June 1918, we have the Declarations of the Seven. Leading up to this, 7 prominent Damascus politicians sent a letter to London going, WTF, you're giving away territory that was promised to us. What's going on? We want some clarification. And the Declaration of the Seven said it's British policy for the people of the region to be governed based on the consent of the governed. That is, the people on the ground decide who rules them. And the 7 notable politicians went, okay, it's going to be mostly Arabs. Yeah, that's fine by us. In addition, you have an Anglo-French declaration on the 7th of November, 1918, where it stated the declared goal of the French and the British governments with respect to the Ottomans was, quote, the complete and definite emancipation of the people so long oppressed by the Turks. That is, all the national groups in the Ottoman Empire should be completely and definitively freed. And the establishment of national governments and administrations deriving their authority from the free choice of the indigenous population. In other words, they wanted government, they said it's a state, the declared goal of these governments to establish a national government for each of these peoples based on their own free choice. And the Arabs went, why are you saying that again? I mean, we agree with it, but it's starting to smell a little fishy. Methinks the lady doth protest too much, to quote Shakespeare. And in, there we go, a committee meeting of the British Cabinet Eastern Committee on 5 December 1918, they clarified the Palestine position. And the Foreign Secretary basically said, well, we have a number of different commitments. We have the general pledge to Hussein, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, in which Palestine is part of that area. Palestine being right here. And so naturally that falls under the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. And Britain pledged itself that this should be Arab and independent. However, a wrinkle has come in with Mr. Balfour, with the authority of the cabinet. There should be nothing to prejudice the civil and religious rights of people in Palestine. As far as I know, according to the Foreign Secretary, those are the only 2 actual engagements Britain has entered into. He's kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth, saying civil and religious rights should be adhered to, but yeah, it is kind of an Arab land. So again, this is sort of protesting a little too much. All right. So that's the McMahon-Hussein correspondences. The Sykes-Picot Agreement will go a little quicker. You guys are probably familiar with what the Sykes-Picot Agreement is. It was negotiated between, it was a treaty and an agreement, but negotiated between Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and Francois Georges Picot of France, basically splitting up the spoils when the Ottoman Empire crumbles. Boom. This was initially a secret treaty between Britain, France, and Russia, with each dividing up the Ottoman Empire. Britain was allocated direct control of areas, basically modern-day Iraq. This was because they had significant oil interests in the area. Pardon me. As well as the coastal strip between the Mediterranean and the River Jordan, and basically this area here. France was given direct control of Lebanon and an area in Anatolia, and French influence in basically Syria and northern Iraq. Russia was to get Constantinople, the Turkish Straits, as well as some areas in the Caucasus Mountains. It was up to the controlling areas, France, Britain, and Russia. They were left free to decide on the state boundaries within their own areas. So France, if they wanted, could have kept this entire area as one area, so could have Britain. They could have Britain could have decided if it wanted to carve up the red zone into little itty bitty pieces. It did not. And further negotiation was expected to determine basically what else would happen after the war, including with other powers like the Sharif of Mecca. Whoops. And for Britain, France, and Russia, everything was perfectly fine, perfectly great, until a small little event called the Russian Revolution. Because with the success of the Bolsheviks in November 1917, well, they were rummaging through old government buildings and going through government files, and they came across, oh, look, this is a secret agreement between France, Russia, and Britain. It would be very embarrassing to France and Britain if this were released. So they released the text of the, quote, secret treaty in an attempt to embarrass the French and the British, to basically show any of the colonized powers, look, they don't have your best interests at heart. What the release of the Sykes-Picot Agreement does is attempt to put to lie the rhetoric of self-determination being put out by the French, being put out by the British. The British are going, yes, 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 self-determination, self-determination, self-determination. But in reality, it's like, look, yeah, we're directly controlling this area. Britain, you take control of that area. And yeah, we'll probably just take that area too. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, I mean, this is going to be a legal treaty between Britain and France that effectively negates the McMahon-Hussein correspondences. This will cause lingering resentment even today amongst Arabs who believe that they were swindled into revolting against the Turks for the benefit of the West. The Sykes-Picot Agreement will form the foundation of the mandate system after the war. We're going to get to the mandate system, I promise you. See, I told you Sykes-Picot, that'll be short and sweet. This brings us to the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Now, before we get to the Balfour Declaration, I have to set the scene, because I have to talk about this concept called political Zionism, and I have to talk about Jewish immigration to Palestine. Now, if things weren't bad enough with Britain in the Middle East, so we have voice number 1, McMahon-Hussein correspondence. Voice number 2, Sykes-Picot agreement. Voice number 3 now is the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration will throw the biggest monkey wrench into the area. And I have to talk about the background to Zionism, the background to political Zionism. Now, Zionism, in short, is the Jewish nationalist movement that had as its goal, it's a Jewish nationalist movement that had as its goal the creation and the support of a Jewish national state in Palestine. It had as its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews. Think back last video to the idea of nation. Shared history, shared language, shared religion, shared territory. And I'm missing one. So the Jewish people are arguing, we are a nation without a state. We have a shared history. We have a shared religion. We have a shared history, religion. What? I did not mean to flip you guys off. Shared history, shared religion, shared language, Yiddish. Shared ethnicity, Jewish. The only thing missing is a shared territory. And that territory, political Zionists believed, was the ancient homeland of the Jews in Palestine. And in the late 19th century, you have a number of politically connected Jews in Europe, particularly politicians, particularly bankers. I'm going to actually move my face away from the guy riding the turtle. You have a number of politically connected Jews in Europe, particularly politicians and bankers, start developing a worldwide Zionist movement. And the three key figures I want to talk about are Theodor Herzl with the big beard, Chaim Weizmann in the middle with the glasses, and Walter Rothschild riding the tortoise. So first, let us talk about Theodor Herzl. I'm going to go back to the key terms and hard words. There we are. So Herzl, Weizmann, and Rothschild. So Theodor Herzl was born in the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Herzl will be the figure from which most of the 20th century Zionism, I should say, will get its political motivations. In 1895, and I thought I had this as a key term, but I don't. In 1895, Herzl publishes Der Judenstaat, D-E-R space J-U-D-E-N-S-T-A-A-T. Der Judenstaat, D-E-R-J-U-D-E-N-S-T-A-A-T. Der Judenstaat, D-E-R space J-U-D-E-N-S-T-A-A-T. Published in 1895. Der Judenstaat would outline the reasons why Jews must leave Europe. The short reason, anti-Semitism. And as they are a nation without a state, they must establish a state where they could freely practice their culture and religion. And Herzl, as a major figure in the Zionist movement, did some negotiations. He negotiated with Britain and managed to get Britain to agree to provide the Jewish people with a homeland. And so this is This is a couple years after Der Judenstaat. So he goes to the World Zionist Organization and says, "Hey guys, guess what? I got some good news. I have Britain. I have an agreement from Britain saying they will give us land for our own to create as a Jewish national state." And everyone went, "Yay! Woo! Ah, that's so awesome! Woo! Yay! Go Herzl!" And then somebody goes, "So, Theodore, yes. Where are we going?" Opens up the paper, Uganda. And everybody just went stone silent. And Herzl sort of looked up, looked down, looked up, looked down, and basically said, "Do you guys want to go to Uganda?" Everybody went, "No." And so he went, "Rip, we're not going to Uganda. Yay!" And so the focus thereafter would be Palestine. So Chaim Weizmann, he's the second of the prominent Zionists I want to mention. Weizmann was born in the Russian Empire. Chaim Weizmann will emerge as a leader of the British Zionist movement. Weizmann in Britain, after he immigrated to Britain, made political connections and promoted the Zionist movement, becoming friends with Arthur Balfour, the future author of the Balfour Declaration, and David Lloyd George, who was the prime minister during the second half of the First World War. And he became prominent because he was a chemist. And during the war, he basically came up with they called it smokeless, but there was still some smokeless. There was still some smoke, a smokeless propellant for artillery shells. I mean, if you've ever seen any pictures or video of World War I cannons firing off, you see the large plumes of smoke. Weizmann came up with a propellant that basically limited the amount of smoke, and rather than basically charging Great Britain to use it, he basically said, "Look, I will, out of the kindness of my heart, let you guys have this. Remember me. Remember my name. Remember what I did for you, but I will let you guys have it for free." And so Weizmann was able to make friends and gain proponents for Zionism within the British government. Last but not least, we have the second Baron Rothschild, Walter Rothschild. He was head of one of the most prominent banking families in Britain. Baron Rothschild was a prominent Zionist and friend to both Chaim Weizmann and Arthur Balfour. Rothschild was able to put political and economic pressure on the British government to support the goals of the Zionists, and he certainly enjoyed riding them tortoises. Boom, there we go. So we have in Britain a political lobby group headed predominantly by Weizmann and Rothschild to push for British support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, the worldwide Zionist organizations weren't sitting on their hands while this was happening, because between 1882, I'm going to move my face. There we go. There we go. Between 1882 and 1923, we have multiple waves of aliyahs, also known as Jewish immigration to Palestine. Now, the first aliyah taking place 1882 to 1903. These are people primarily from the Russian Empire. This first wave, again, about 11 years, of approximately 35,000 people. This first wave of approximately 35,000 immigrants were fleeing from the anti-Semitic pogroms, the anti-Semitic riots that were occurring in Russia. This wave was primarily farmers and established primarily farming communities. So very much rural, very much less concerned with Zionism and more concerned with, I need to live somewhere where somebody won't try to kill me. Then we have a second wave between 1903 and 1914. Obviously, the war would stop immigration. You have approximately 40,000 immigrants from the Russian Empire. This wave arrived in the southwestern Ottoman province of Syria. So we're looking at basically them arriving in this area right here. This would be the second wave. There we are. Approximately 40,000 immigrants from the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe. They arrived in the area I just showed you guys and began establishing more urban communities. Most prominently, they would establish the future capital of Tel Aviv, Israel. This was more urban, so their focus was more on city dwelling. Tended to be a little more middle class, whereas the First Aliyah tended to be slightly more lower class. Then 1919 to 1923, we have the Third Aliyah, where you have approximately 40,000 Jews from Eastern Europe. These immigrants were more ideologically oriented. They were focused more on creating the conditions on the ground to implement the Balfour Declaration. This wave of immigration will spark the Arab reprisals that we will talk more about during the next video when I talk about the Hashemite kingdoms. So if you look at just the numbers, you're looking at about 11 years here, 35,000. So you're looking at about 3,300-ish people a year. Not too bad. Secondly, in 1903 to 1914, again about 11 years, you're looking at about 40,000, so about 3,800 a year. Again, not bad. Thirdly, in 1919 to 1923, so we're looking 5 years. Now all of a sudden you're looking at 8,000 people per year, effectively doubling what had previously come in the first two Aliyahs. So that's background to political Zionism. That's talking about Jewish immigration to Palestine. In that case, let's look at the Balfour Declaration itself. And this is it. This is one of the most important documents of the 20th century. That's the entirety of it. The Balfour Declaration on 2 November 1917 was announced in a letter to Baron Rothschild. This will be the third promise, the third voice made by the British government with respect to the Middle East. My dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. Quote, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. That's basically what the Foreign Secretary sort of emphasized in the cabinet meeting, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I'd be grateful if you could bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur Balfour. If you can't quite read it, here is the important part. This paragraph basically determines the Jewish promise made by Britain with respect to the Middle East. Boop. So we went from, hey, let's promise the Arabs this territory here, to, okay, yeah, we kind of promise you this territory, but yeah, we're taking control of the oil here, and yeah, we're taking control of this area here. Oh yeah, we'll just take control of all this area here. to, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to try and keep control there. Let us, actually I've just decided, I've talked a lot. I'm going to break it up. I'm going to talk about the mandate system in the next video and then continue on with the Hashemites there. So hit that button. We are going to stop sharing. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pick up with the mandate system. In the next video, we're going to do the mandate system, and then we're going to talk about the Hashemite kingdoms. So in that case, go forth, slay dragons, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.